Sometimes the gentlest souls carry the deepest scars. Sometimes a man's greatest strength lies buried beneath his greatest pain. In the mountain village of Skelvik, Ulf Thundertouched was the giant everyone feared, 7 feet tall and covered. In battle scars, he lived alone, worked alone, and spoke to no one. Parents warned their children to stay away from his forge. Warriors crossed the street when they saw him coming. But one spring morning, little Freya changed everything. The blacksmith's 4-year-old daughter climbed onto a bench, pointed at the towering warrior, and declared for all to hear, "I'm not afraid of you." What happened next stunned the entire village. Instead of anger, Ulf knelt down. Instead of harsh words, he listened. And when she poked his beard and laughed, something long frozen in his heart began to thaw. Could one fearless child show a broken warrior that it's never too late to find your way back to being human? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The village of Skelvik clung to the mountainside like a stubborn barnacle, its wooden houses weathered grey by countless winters. Smoke curled from stone chimneys into the crisp morning air, carrying the familiar scents of burning pine and hearthbread. The settlement had endured for 3 generations, carved from the wilderness by men and women who understood that survival meant community, and community meant knowing your place. At the heart of the village stood the great hall, its timber walls, bearing the carved shields of fallen warriors and the antlers of mighty elk. Around it, like spokes on a wheel, radiated the homes of fishermen, farmers, and craftsmen. The blacksmith's forge occupied a place of honor near the hall's entrance, its anvil ringing out the rhythm of daily life as metal was shaped into tools, weapons, and hope. But at the village's edge, where the forest pressed close and shadows lingered even in daylight, stood a different kind of dwelling. Larger than the others, built with the precision of a man who had learned architecture in foreign lands, it remained perpetually silent. No smoke rose from its chimney except at dawn and dusk. No visitors crossed its threshold. No laughter echoed from its walls. This was where Ulf Thundertouched made his solitary existence. The name itself carried weight in Skelvik. Children whispered it in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly might summon the giant from his self-imposed exile. Adults spoke of him with a mixture of respect and unease, remembering the day he had arrived 7 years ago, bloodied, broken, and bearing grief like a second skin. He had come during the harshest winter in living memory, when wolves grew bold enough to test the village defenses, and even the hardiest men questioned whether spring would ever return. The first glimpse of him had been enough to stop conversations mid-sentence. 7 feet of muscle and bone, wrapped in the kind of scars that spoke of battles both won and lost. His beard, now streaked with silver, had been black as a raven's wing then. His eyes, the pale blue of winter ice, held depths that warned against curiosity. The village elders had debated his presence in heated council sessions. Some argued for turning him away. What good could come from harboring a man who radiated such darkness? Others, wiser perhaps, recognized the signs of a warrior pushed beyond his breaking point. They had seen it before in men returning from raids, in fathers who had buried children, in anyone who had stared too long into the abyss of human suffering. In the end, practical necessity had decided the matter. Ulf had gold, enough to purchase land, materials, and solitude. More importantly, he possessed skills the village needed. His hands could craft weapons that held their edge through the most brutal fighting. His knowledge of fortifications had helped them strengthen their defenses against both wolves and raiders. And though none dared speak it aloud, his mere presence served as a deterrent to those who might consider Skelvik an easy target. So they had accepted him, with the understanding that acceptance did not mean inclusion. The arrangement had worked well enough for 7 years. Ulf built his house with methodical precision, establishing routines that rarely varied. He rose before dawn to tend a small fire, worked through the day on projects that remained mysterious to his neighbors, and retired at sunset without fail. He spoke only when necessity demanded it, brief exchanges with merchants, terse acknowledgements. Of council decisions that affected property boundaries, nothing more. The village children learned to recognize the signs of his approach, the heavy footfalls that seemed to shake the ground, the way birds fell silent in the trees, the sudden chill that had nothing to do with mountain air. Their parents taught them to look away, to find urgent business elsewhere, to never under any circumstances stare at the giant who carried winter in his heart. But children, as any parent knows, possess a curiosity that defies the most careful instruction. Freya Eriksdottir had been testing boundaries since she learned to walk. The youngest of blacksmith Erik's 3 daughters, she possessed her father's stubborn will and her mother's gentle heart, a combination that led to adventures her sisters would never have attempted. Where her older siblings, Astrid and Solveig, were content to help with household duties and learn the skills expected of Viking daughters, Freya preferred exploring the forest edges, befriending stray cats, and asking questions that made adults uncomfortable. Her parents, Gunhild and Erik, watched their youngest with a mixture of pride and exasperation. Gunhild often said that Freya had been born with her eyes wide open, as if determined not to miss a single moment of the world around her. Erik, more practical in his concerns, worried that her fearlessness would lead her into danger she couldn't understand. "She has no sense of proper caution," he had confided to his wife just the previous evening, watching Freya attempt to coax an injured raven from its perch. "The world is full of things that can hurt little girls who don't know when to be afraid." Gunhild had smiled at that, the way wives do when they see their husbands wrestling with problems that have no easy solutions. "Perhaps the world needs more little girls who refuse to be afraid," she had replied. "Fear has its place, but so does courage. How else will she learn the difference?" Now, as morning light painted the village square in shades of gold and amber, that very fearlessness was about to change everything. The day had begun like any other. Merchants were setting up their stalls for the weekly market, displaying pottery, furs, and tools for trade. Fishermen were mending nets and checking their boats for the day's work. Women were drawing water from the central well, while their children played nearby games of tag and hide-and-seek. Astrid and Solveig were helping their mother arrange bread loaves for sale, their movements efficient and practiced. At 16 and 14 respectively, they had grown into the kind of responsible daughters who could be trusted with important tasks. Freya, at 4 years old, was considered too young for such responsibilities, though she often tried to help. Anyway, this morning, however, her attention was captured by something far more intriguing than bread arrangement. From her perch on a wooden crate beside her mother's stall, Freya had spotted movement at the village's edge. The giant, the one everyone whispered about but never approached, was walking toward the square. His massive frame moved with surprising grace, each step deliberate and measured. He carried something in his hands, though she couldn't make out what it was from this distance. As always happened when Ulf Thundertouched appeared in public, conversations died away. Merchants suddenly found their wares in need of urgent rearrangement. Children were pulled closer to their parents. Even the dogs seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, retreating to safer positions behind their master's legs. But Freya had never learned the proper protocol for fear. Where others saw a terrifying giant, she saw something else entirely. A man who walked alone, who carried sadness like a heavy cloak, who reminded her of the wounded animals she often tried to help. She slipped from her crate with the fluid grace that only small children possess, moving through the crowd like a minnow through still water. Her mother, distracted by a customer's questions about grain prices, didn't notice her youngest daughter's departure. Her sisters, focused on their own tasks, assumed she was playing nearby as usual. By the time anyone realized what was happening, Freya had already climbed onto the wooden bench that served as an impromptu speaker's platform during village meetings. The bench stood in the square's center, elevated enough to give her a clear view over the adult heads, and more importantly, to ensure that she could be seen by everyone present, including the approaching giant. Her small voice carried clearly. In the morning air, cutting through the silence like a blade through fabric. 4 simple words that would echo in village memory for generations to come. The effect was instantaneous and electric. Every head turned, every conversation stopped, every breath seemed to pause. In that moment, the entire village held its collective breath, waiting to see how their worst fears might be realized. But what happened next would prove that sometimes the most profound truths come from the smallest voices, and that healing often begins with the courage to see beyond the surface of things. The words hung in the air like frost on a window pane, beautiful and impossible to ignore. "I'm not afraid of you." Freya's declaration echoed off the wooden walls of the surrounding buildings, each syllable crystal clear and unmistakably defiant. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, nothing moved. The entire village square had transformed into a tableau of frozen figures, each person caught in their own moment of shock and disbelief. Merchants stood with their hands halfway to their wares. Mothers clutched empty water buckets. Children peeked out from behind adult legs with wide, curious eyes, and at the center of it all, 2 figures faced each other across an impossible divide of size, age, and circumstance. Ulf Thundertouched had stopped mid-stride, his massive frame silhouetted against the morning sky. The object in his hands, now visible as a small wooden carving, seemed to tremble slightly, though whether from the giant's reaction or the observer's imagination was impossible to tell. His pale blue eyes, usually as cold and distant as mountain peaks, focused entirely on the tiny figure standing atop the bench. Freya, for her part, showed no sign of understanding the magnitude of what she had just done. Her small hands rested on her hips in a gesture of pure determination, her golden hair catching the sunlight like spun silk. Her green eyes, so much like her mother's, sparkled with the kind of fearless curiosity that had gotten her into trouble since she could walk. The silence stretched on, growing heavier with each passing second. Someone in the crowd made a small, involuntary sound, half gasp, half prayer. Another person shuffled their feet nervously against the packed earth of the square. But still, no one moved to intervene, as if they were all participants in some ancient ritual where the wrong word or gesture might shatter everything. Then, slowly, deliberately, Ulf Thundertouched began to move. But instead of the explosion of rage that everyone expected, instead of the roar of fury that had been whispered about in cautionary tales, something entirely different happened. The giant began to lower himself, folding his massive frame with the careful precision of a man handling delicate glasswork. Down he went, first to a crouch, then further still, until his knees touched the cold stone of the square. From this position, his eyes were nearly level with Freya's, though his shoulders still towered above her small form. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to every story and assumption about the fearsome warrior, that several people in the crowd actually took a step backward in surprise. Up close, Freya could see details that distance had hidden. The scars that crossed Ulf's weathered features weren't just random marks of violence. They told stories of battles fought and survived, of pain endured and overcome. His beard, streaked with silver threads, was neatly braided despite his reputation for solitary living. And his eyes, those pale blue depths that had frightened grown warriors, held something she recognized from her own experience with wounded creatures. Sadness, deep, bone-weary sadness that had settled into every line of his face like sediment in a still pond. Without hesitation, with the kind of fearless compassion that belongs uniquely to children, Freya reached out and touched his beard. Her small fingers encountered hair that was surprisingly soft, surprisingly well cared for. She tugged gently, experimentally, the way she might test the fur of a large dog to see if it was friendly. And then, impossible as sunlight in a snowstorm, she laughed. It was a sound of pure delight, the kind of laughter that bubbles up from a child's soul when they discover something wonderful and unexpected. It rang across the square like the peal of church bells, clear and joyous and utterly transformative. The effect on Ulf was immediate and profound. Something shifted in his expression, like ice cracking under the pressure of spring warmth. The rigid mask he had worn for 7 years began to slip, revealing glimpses of the man he had been before grief and guilt had carved him into a living statue. His voice, when it finally came, was rusty from disuse, but surprisingly gentle. "Hello, little one." The words were simple, barely above a whisper, but they carried the weight of years of silence finally broken. In the crowd, people began to exchange glances of amazement. This was not the terrifying giant of their imaginations. This was something else entirely, a man capable of tenderness, of connection, of humanity. Freya tilted her head to one side, studying his face with the intensity that children bring to interesting puzzles. "You're very big," she observed matter-of-factly, "but you have kind eyes like grandfather's horse." A sound escaped from Ulf's throat, part laugh, part sob, entirely unexpected. When had anyone last compared him to something kind? When had anyone looked at him and seen anything other than a monster to be feared and avoided? "What's your name?" Freya continued, her small hand still resting against his beard as if it belonged there. "Mama says it's rude not to introduce yourself when you meet someone new." The question hung between them, heavy with implications. In 7 years, no one in Skelvik had asked his name. Not really. They knew his title, his reputation, the stories that followed him like shadows. But his name, that was something more. Personal, more human than they had dared to approach. "Ulf," he said finally, the single syllable carrying more weight than a full conversation. "My name is Ulf. I'm Freya," she replied, with the kind of formal politeness that showed her mother's. "Careful training. Freya, Eric's daughter. Papa makes things with fire and metal. What do you make?" The question was innocent enough, but it struck at the heart of something profound. What did he make? For 7 years, he had crafted weapons and tools, functional items, that served immediate needs, but carried no joy, no connection to the larger tapestry of community life. When had he last created something simply for the pleasure of creation? His eyes dropped to the carving in his hands, a small wooden horse, its mane flowing as if caught in an eternal wind. He had been carrying it without conscious thought. One of dozens he carved during the long evening hours when sleep refused to come. Usually he burned them in his fireplace, unable to bear the memories they evoked. But now, looking at this fearless child who had shattered years of careful isolation with a few simple words, he found himself offering it to her. "I make these," he said, holding out the carving, "though I'm not sure why anymore." Freya's eyes widened with delight as she accepted the gift, turning it over in her small hands with the careful attention it deserved. The workmanship was exquisite. Every detail of the horse's form had been rendered with loving precision, from the arch of its neck to the flow of its tail. "It's beautiful," she breathed, her voice filled with the kind of wonder that makes adults remember why they once believed in magic. "Can I keep it?" The question was so simple, so trusting, that it nearly undid him completely. When had anyone wanted to keep something he had made? When had his work brought joy instead of fear? "Yes," he managed, his voice rough with emotions he had thought long buried. "Yes, you may keep it." The crowd had begun to stir, the spell of the moment slowly breaking as people processed what they had witnessed. Gunhild had spotted her missing daughter and was pushing through the gathered villagers, her face a mixture of terror and confusion. Eric was close behind, his blacksmith's hammer still clutched in one hand, as if he might need to defend his child from the giant she had just befriended. But as they drew closer, what they saw defied every expectation, every fear. every carefully constructed assumption about the man who had lived among them for 7 years without truly being part of their community. They saw Ulf Thundertouched, the most feared warrior in 3 valleys, kneeling in the dirt of their village square while a 4-year-old girl patted his beard and chatted about horses and family as if they were old friends reuniting after a brief separation. And in that moment, everything changed. Not just for Ulf, not just for Freya, but for the entire village of Skelvik. The careful barriers they had built between themselves and the giant began to crumble, revealing possibilities none of them had dared to imagine. The healing had begun, sparked by the fearless words of a child who had never learned that some people were too broken to be saved. The wooden horse became Freya's most treasured possession, never leaving her side as she went about her daily adventures. She named him Stormwind, after the way his carved mane seemed to flow in an eternal breeze, and created elaborate stories about his brave journeys across distant mountains and through enchanted forests. But more than the gift itself, it was what the horse represented that began to weave new patterns into the fabric of Skelvik's daily life. 3 days after the encounter in the square, Freya appeared at Ulf's door. He had been working in his small garden, tending to the herbs he grew for healing salves, a skill learned in foreign lands where battlefield medicine meant the difference between life and death. The sound of small footsteps on his carefully maintained path made him freeze, his weathered hands still gripping the wooden handle of his hoe. In 7 years, no one had approached his home uninvited. The very idea seemed to violate some unspoken law of the village, a boundary as solid as the stone walls that protected them from winter storms. "Ulf," Freya's voice called out, clear and confident. "Are you home? I brought you something." Slowly, cautiously, he rose from his crouch among the herb beds. There she stood at his gate, her golden hair braided with wild flowers, the wooden horse clutched in one small hand while the other held something wrapped in rough cloth. "Your mother knows you're here?" he asked, his voice still rusty from disuse, but gentler than he remembered it being in years. "Mama said I could visit, but only if I promised to come straight back for supper," Freya replied, pushing open the gate with the casual confidence of someone who had never learned to doubt her welcome anywhere. "She made extra honey cakes, and I thought you might be hungry." The simplicity of the gesture struck him like a physical blow. When had anyone last thought about whether he was hungry? When had anyone shared their abundance instead of merely tolerating his presence? He accepted the cloth bundle with hands that trembled slightly, unwrapping it to reveal 3 golden honey cakes, their surfaces still warm from Gunhild's oven. The sweet scent rose between them like an offering, carrying with it the warmth of hearth and home and belonging. "They're very good," Freya said seriously, settling herself on a large stone that served as his doorstep. "Mama makes the best honey cakes in the whole village. Papa says so, and he's tasted everyone's." Ulf found himself sitting beside her, his massive frame dwarfing the stone, but somehow fitting into the moment perfectly. He bit into one of the cakes, and the familiar flavors of honey and grain and careful preparation flooded his senses with memories he had thought safely buried. Another kitchen, another time, another little girl with honey on her fingers and laughter in her eyes. He pushed the memory away before it could fully form, but not before Freya noticed the shadow that crossed his features. "Are you sad?" she asked with the directness that only children possess. "You look sad sometimes, like when Stormwind's leg got hurt and he couldn't run with the other horses." The reference to her beloved pet goat, named like the wooden horse, with the grand imagination of childhood, almost brought a smile to his lips, almost. "Sometimes grown people carry sadness," he said carefully, searching for words that a 4-year-old could understand without burdening her with truths too heavy for small shoulders. "Like a pack that gets heavier, the longer you carry it," Freya considered this with the solemnity she brought to all important matters. "Papa says, when something's too heavy to carry alone, you ask for help. That's what families do." The word family hit him like a blacksmith's hammer against anvil, ringing, with implications he wasn't ready to explore. He had no family, had chosen to have no family, had convinced himself that solitude was safer, cleaner, less prone to the kind of devastating loss that could break a man completely. But here was this child, offering honeycakes and simple wisdom, as if they were the most natural things in the world. "What else does your papa say?" he found himself asking, genuinely curious about the man who had raised such a remarkable daughter. "He says that everyone has something broken inside them, but that doesn't mean they can't be fixed," Freya replied, swinging her legs from the stone. "He says the best things are the ones that have been broken and mended, because they're stronger afterward." Eric's wisdom, delivered through his youngest daughter's innocent voice, settled into something deep in Ulf's chest. The blacksmith was a thoughtful man. Ulf had observed this much during their brief, necessary interactions over the years. But the depth of understanding, reflected in his child's words, suggested someone who had grappled with his own share of darkness and emerged with hard-won knowledge. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sharing the honey cakes and watching. The afternoon shadows lengthen across Ulf's meticulously maintained garden. Freya chattered about village life, Astrid's upcoming betrothal to the cooper's son, Solveig's skill at weaving, the new litter of kittens that had appeared in the grain storehouse. Her words painted pictures of a community rich with connections, traditions, and the small daily miracles that made life worth living. For the first time in 7 years, Ulf felt the sharp edges of his isolation beginning to blur. When she finally rose to leave, clutching the empty cloth and promising to return soon, he found himself offering something he hadn't planned to give. "If you'd like," he said hesitantly, "I could teach you to carve. Small things at first. Simple animals, perhaps." Freya's face lit up with such pure delight that it physically hurt to look at her. "Really? You would teach me? Mama says learning new things is always good, and Papa says working with your hands makes your heart strong." Her parents' voices, echoing through their daughter's enthusiasm, reminded him that this child belonged to people who loved her, who would be watching his interactions with her carefully. The thought was both sobering and oddly comforting. He would be accountable to them, responsible for proving himself worthy of their trust. "Tomorrow, then," he said, already questioning the wisdom of the offer, but unable to retract it in the face of her obvious joy. "After your morning chores." As she skipped down the path toward the village center, Stormwind the wooden horse bouncing in her hand, Ulf stood in his doorway and felt something shift in the careful architecture of his solitude. It was a small crack, barely perceptible, but significant enough to let in the first rays of light he had allowed himself in years. In the village square, word of Freya's visit spread with the speed that only small communities can achieve. By evening, every household knew that the blacksmith's youngest daughter had spent an afternoon with the giant, sharing honey cakes and conversation as if such things happened every day. The reactions varied widely. Some worried about the wisdom of allowing a child so much freedom around a man they still considered dangerous. Others saw opportunity in the unexpected connection, a chance to finally bridge the gap that had separated Ulf from their community for so long. But in the blacksmith's house, as Gunhild tucked her youngest daughter into bed, the conversation was quieter and more thoughtful. "Was he kind to you?" she asked, smoothing Freya's golden hair across her pillow. "Very kind," Freya replied sleepily, the wooden horse cradled against her chest. "He has sad eyes, but they get less sad when he smiles, and he knows things about healing herbs and faraway places. He's going to teach me to carve tomorrow." Gunhild exchanged a meaningful look with Eric, who stood in the doorway, listening to his daughter's account. 7 years of careful distance were beginning to crumble, and neither parent was entirely sure what would emerge from the ruins. The carving lessons began the next afternoon, and with them came a transformation that no one in Skelvik could have. Predicted Ulf had prepared carefully for Freya's arrival, selecting a piece of soft pine that would be forgiving to small, inexperienced hands. He had sharpened one of his smaller knives until its edge was perfect, keen enough to cut cleanly, but not so sharp as to be dangerous in the grip of a 4-year-old. Most importantly, he had cleared a space on his workbench where they could sit side by side, the height adjusted so that Freya could work comfortably. When she arrived, punctual as always and carrying another small offering from her mother, this time a jar of berry preserves, she examined his preparations with the serious attention of a master craftsman reviewing an apprentice's work. "This is where we'll carve?" she asked, running her small fingers along the smooth wood of the bench. "Yes," Ulf replied, surprised by how nervous he felt. When had he last taught anyone anything? When had anyone looked to him for guidance rather than simply fearing his presence? "We'll start with something simple, perhaps a small bird." The first lesson was a study in patience. Freya's enthusiasm far exceeded her coordination, and more than once Ulf had to gently guide her hands away from cuts that would have sent her running home in tears. But her determination was remarkable, and her willingness to listen and learn reminded him of teaching moments from a life he had tried to forget. "Like this?" she asked for the dozenth time, holding up a piece of wood that barely resembled anything recognizable. "Exactly like that," he said, and meant it. The joy in her face as she worked, the way her tongue poked out slightly in concentration, the careful way she examined each cut to see how it had changed the wood's shape, all of it reminded him why he had first fallen in love with carving as a young man. By the end of the first week, word of the lessons had spread throughout the village. People found excuses to walk past Ulf's house during the afternoon hours, hoping to catch glimpses of the unlikely pair bent over their work. What they saw challenged everything they thought they knew about the giant who had lived among them. For 7 years, here was a man capable of infinite patience, who celebrated a child's small victories as if they were great triumphs. Here was someone who could make learning feel like play, who turned mistakes into opportunities rather than causes for frustration. Here was a teacher whose gentle voice and careful hands revealed a depth of character that his fearsome reputation had hidden. Eric was among the watchers, though he tried to be discreet about his supervision. As a father, he felt responsible for ensuring his daughter's safety. As a craftsman, he was curious about Ulf's teaching methods. What he observed exceeded his most optimistic expectations. "She's learning quickly," he commented one evening when he stopped by to collect Freya for supper. Ulf looked up from the small owl they had been working on, Freya's second successful project, and nodded slowly. "She has good hands and a good heart for the work. She listens to what the wood wants to become." The statement revealed more about Ulf's philosophy than Eric had expected. This wasn't just craft instruction. It was a kind of meditation, a way of connecting with the natural world through careful attention and respect. "Would you?" Eric began, then stopped, unsure how to phrase what he was thinking. "Yes?" Ulf prompted, his pale eyes curious but not hostile. "Would you consider teaching others? My nephew Bjorn has been asking about woodwork, and there are other young people in the village who might benefit from learning such skills." The suggestion hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. For Ulf, it represented something he hadn't dared to imagine, a chance to be useful to the community in ways that went beyond his reputation as a feared warrior. For Eric, it was an opportunity to help heal the divisions that had kept their village from being whole. "I would need to think about it," Ulf said finally. "Teaching one eager child is different from teaching several." "Of course," Eric replied. "But if you were willing, I believe many families would be grateful for the opportunity." That night, as Ulf carved by the light of his fireplace, he found himself considering the possibility. For years, his hands had created weapons of war, tools of destruction that served only to end conflicts through force. But teaching Freya had reminded him of carving's other purpose, the quiet joy of creation, the satisfaction of bringing beauty into the world through patience and skill. The change in his daily routine had already begun to affect other aspects of his life. Where once he had eaten his evening meals in complete silence, now he found himself thinking about Freya's questions and observations, planning tomorrow's lesson, remembering the sound of her laughter when she successfully completed a difficult cut. Sleep, which had been elusive for years, came more easily now. The nightmares that had haunted him since arriving in Skelvik were less frequent, pushed back by memories of afternoon conversations about village life, carving techniques, and the elaborate adventures of wooden horses named Stormwind. 3 weeks into the lessons, Freya presented him with her first independent project, a small rabbit she had carved entirely on her own, working on it during her free time at home. The proportions were imperfect, the surface showed the marks of uncertain cuts, but the essential character of the animal was unmistakably there. "I made it for you," she said shyly, offering the carving with both hands, "because you gave me Stormwind. And Mama says gift should be shared between friends." The word friends stopped him cold. When had he last had a friend? When had anyone claimed him as such without reservation or hidden motive? He accepted the rabbit with hands that shook slightly, turning it over to examine her work with the same careful attention he would give a master craftsman's creation. Every uncertain cut spoke of effort and determination. Every imperfection told the story of a child pushing herself to create something meaningful. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "I will treasure it always," and he meant it. In that moment, holding an imperfect rabbit carved by trusting hands, Ulf Thundertouched felt something he had thought lost forever. The possibility of belonging somewhere, of being valued for who he was, rather than feared for who he had been. The walls around his heart, built stone by stone over years of grief and guilt, had developed their first significant crack. And through that crack, light was beginning to seep in, warming places that had been cold for far too long. In the village, people were beginning to whisper about changes in the giant. He nodded when he passed them on the street now, sometimes even offered a quiet greeting. His step seemed lighter, his shoulders less burdened. The eternal winter that had surrounded him was showing signs of thaw. But change, as every wise person knows, brings its own complications. And there were those in Skelvik who were not entirely comfortable with the transformation they were witnessing. The first note of discord came from Ragnar Ironbeard, the village's eldest warrior and self-appointed keeper of traditions. At 63, he had earned his authority through decades of successful raids, wise counsel, and an unwavering commitment to the old ways that had kept Skelvik strong through 3 generations of challenges. On a grey morning in late spring, as mist clung to the mountainsides like ghostly fingers, Ragnar made his concerns known to the village council. "We are forgetting who we harbour among us," he said, his weathered hands gripping the carved arms of his council chair. 7 years ago, Ulf Thundertouched came to us bloodied and broken, carrying secrets he has never shared. Now we watch him, charm our children, and wonder why we ever feared him. But I remember the stories that followed in his wake." The council chamber fell silent. Around the great oak table sat the 5 elders who guided Skelvik's important decisions: Eric the blacksmith, Ingrid the weaver, Magnus the fisherman, Olaf the farmer, and Ragnar himself. These were people who had built the village from wilderness, who understood that survival often required difficult choices. "What stories?" asked Ingrid. Though her tone suggested she might already know the answer, Ragnar's eyes, still sharp despite his years, swept the faces of his fellow council members. "They say he was once called the Berserker of Nordfjord. They say he led a warband that could break armies twice their size. They say—" He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "They say he lost control during a raid and slaughtered innocents along with enemies." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Eric felt his breath catch in his throat. This was the man who had been teaching his daughter to carve wooden animals, who spoke to her with such gentle patience that even Gunhild had begun to trust him completely. Stories follow many warriors, Magnus said carefully. Half are lies, and the other half are truths so twisted they might as well be lies. Perhaps, Ragnar conceded, but can we afford to assume the best when our children's safety might be at stake? Young Freya spends hours alone with him. What if the old darkness returns? What if whatever broke him before breaks him again? The questions struck at the heart of every parent's deepest fears. They had all watched their children grow up in a world where threats could emerge without warning. Raiders from other villages, wild animals driven to desperation by harsh winters, accidents that could claim a life in moments. Adding an unpredictable giant to that list of concerns seemed like madness, but Eric found himself remembering the man he had observed teaching his daughter, patient, gentle, more concerned with her safety than his own comfort. That didn't seem like someone capable of the horrors Ragnar described. I've watched him with Freya, Eric said slowly. I've seen how he handles sharp tools around her, how he anticipates danger before it can occur. Whatever he may have been, he shows nothing but care for her well-being now. Now, Ragnar emphasized. But what happens when now changes? What happens when some event triggers memories of whatever trauma drove him to our village? Will his care for one child extend to protecting all of us from what he might become? The debate continued for the better part of an hour, voices rising and falling as the council members wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. In the end, they agreed to continue observing the situation carefully, but to take no immediate action. The decision satisfied no one completely, but it maintained the fragile peace that had begun to develop. Word of the council's discussion, as such things always do in small communities, began to spread through whispered conversations and meaningful glances. By evening, most of Skelvik knew that questions were being raised about Ulf's past and his place in their future. The change in atmosphere was subtle, but unmistakable. Where people had begun to nod greeting when they encountered the giant, now they looked away uncertainly. Where children had started to peek curiously around their parents' legs, now they were pulled closer and hurried past. The careful warming that had begun over the past weeks seemed to freeze again, leaving Ulf isolated in ways that felt familiar and painful. He noticed the shift immediately. 7 years of hypervigilance had taught him to read the subtle signs of community mood, to sense when tolerance might be shifting toward hostility. The skill had kept him alive during his early days in Skelvik, when any misstep might have resulted in his expulsion into the wilderness. But now, having tasted the possibility of belonging, the return to suspicion cut deeper than it had before. That only constant was Freya, who continued to arrive each afternoon for her carving lessons with the same enthusiasm and trust she had shown from the beginning. If she noticed the change in how others treated her teacher, she gave no sign of it. Her world remained focused on learning new techniques, planning her next project, and sharing the small daily adventures that made up a 4-year-old's existence. Astrid is learning to make cheese, she announced one afternoon as they worked. On carving a small fox. She says it's very difficult because you have to know exactly when the milk is ready. Too early and it doesn't work. Too late and it spoils everything. Ulf found wisdom in the comparison. Timing, in cheese-making as in life, could mean the difference between success and failure. Perhaps his attempt to rejoin the community had been premature. Perhaps he had pushed too hard, too fast, before the foundations were properly prepared. Your sister is wise to be careful, he said, guiding Freya's hands as she worked on the fox's delicate ears. Some things cannot be rushed. But some things can't wait too long either, Freya replied with the matter-of-fact wisdom that often surprised him. Mama says you have to find the right moment and then be brave enough to take it. As evening approached and Freya prepared to return home, Ulf found himself facing a decision that would shape everything that followed. He could retreat back into the safety of isolation, protecting both himself and the village from whatever consequences his presence might bring. Or he could trust that the connections he had begun to build were strong enough to weather the storm of suspicion and fear. Standing in his doorway, watching Freya skip down the path with her latest carving clutched proudly in her small hand, he felt the weight of choice settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. The easy path led backward, to solitude and safety. The difficult path led forward, toward uncertainty and the possibility of pain. But it also led toward the possibility of redemption, of finding a place where his past didn't define his future. The bronze amulet around his neck, a warrior's token he had worn for 20 years, seemed to grow heavier as he contemplated the choice before him. Some battles, he had learned, were fought not with sword and shield, but with courage and faith in tomorrow's promise. The test of Ulf's resolve came sooner than expected, arriving in the form of a late spring storm that would challenge everything. Skelvik thought they knew about their reluctant giant. It began as a distant rumble of thunder rolling across the mountains, but within hours it had grown into a tempest that sent everyone scurrying for shelter. Rain lashed the village with unusual ferocity, turning the packed earth of the square into treacherous mud and sending streams of water cascading down from the peaks above. By evening, the storm had revealed a weakness in Skelvik's defenses that no one had anticipated. The retaining wall that protected the lower houses from flooding, built 20 years ago by men who had since grown old or died, had developed a dangerous crack. Water was seeping through with increasing force, and if the wall failed completely, half the village would be underwater by morning. Magnus the fisherman was the first to spot the problem, his experienced eye recognizing the signs of imminent collapse. Within minutes, every able-bodied man in the village had gathered in the driving rain, assessing the damage and debating solutions. "We need to shore it up from this side," Eric shouted over the howling wind, pointing to where the crack was widest. "Build a framework that can hold until the storm passes." "With what?" Magnus replied. "We'd need timbers heavy enough to withstand that pressure, and men strong enough to place them in this weather." As if summoned by their desperation, a massive figure emerged from the storm. Ulf approached the group slowly, his enormous frame cutting through the wind and rain like a ship through rough seas. In his hands, he carried several thick oak beams, timbers that would have required 3 normal men to lift. The villagers fell silent, torn between their need for help and their lingering suspicions about the man offering it. Ragnar, drenched and shivering, but still the voice of authority, stepped forward. "We don't need—" he began, but Eric cut him off. "We need all the help we can get," the blacksmith said firmly, his father's instincts overriding political considerations. Half the endangered houses belonged to families with young children. This was no time for pride or prejudice. Ulf nodded. Bunsen moved toward the weakening wall without waiting for further discussion. His knowledge of construction, gained during his years of military engineering, allowed him to assess the situation quickly and identify the most effective solution. "The foundation stones are shifting," he called back to the group, his voice carrying despite the storm. "We need to redirect the water flow while we reinforce the structure." What followed was 3 hours of desperate work in conditions that would have defeated smaller men. Ulf seemed to be everywhere at once, lifting beams that required multiple helpers for others, digging channels to redirect the floodwater, bracing unstable sections while others worked on permanent repairs. His bronze amulet, normally hidden beneath his shirt, had come free during the effort and now caught occasional flashes of lightning. The ancient symbol seemed to glow in the storm's fury, marking him as what he had always been: a warrior, but one who fought to protect rather than destroy. Young Bjorn, Eric's nephew, found himself working alongside the giant as they struggled to position a critical support beam. At 19, Bjorn was strong and willing, but the timber was beyond his strength to manage alone. "Here," Ulf said simply, taking most of the beam's weight while positioning Bjorn to guide it into place. "Steady now. Feel how it wants to settle." The moment crystallized something important for the young man. This wasn't the terrifying monster of village whispers. This was a master craftsman sharing his knowledge, an experienced leader ensuring everyone's safety. a neighbor who had answered their call for help without hesitation or condition. By midnight, the immediate crisis had passed. The wall stood firm, reinforced by a framework that would hold until proper repairs could be made. The village was safe, the children dry in their beds. The worst disaster in decades, averted by collective effort and unexpected heroism. As the exhausted villagers began to disperse, Ragnar found himself facing a moment of reckoning. He had watched. Ulf worked through the storm, had seen the giant place himself in danger to protect people who had never shown him kindness. The contrast between the man's actions and the dark stories Ragnar had shared couldn't be ignored. "I owe you thanks," he said stiffly, approaching Ulf as the giant gathered his tools. Ulf looked up, water streaming from his hair and beard, his pale eyes reflecting the last flickers of lightning. "You owe me nothing. This is my village too." The simple statement carried profound implications. For 7 years, Ulf had lived in Skelvik, but never claimed it as his own. Now, in the aftermath of crisis, he was stating his commitment to the community's welfare clearly and without reservation. "The stories they tell about you," Ragnar continued, struggling with words that didn't come easily. "Perhaps they don't. You tell the whole truth." "Stories rarely do," Ulf replied. "We are more than our worst moments, just as we are more than our best ones. Tonight, we were neighbors helping neighbors. Sometimes that's enough." The wisdom in those words struck Ragnar like a physical blow. How many years had he spent defining people by their darkest chapters, forgetting that redemption was possible for those brave enough to seek it? Over the following days, word of Ulf's actions during the storm spread through Skelvik with the speed of good news in small places. The image of the giant working tirelessly to protect families who had feared him became a story told and retold, each telling adding new details of his courage and skill. Freya, of course, was bursting with pride when she arrived for her next carving lesson. "Everyone's talking about how brave you were," she announced, practically bouncing with excitement. "Papa says you saved our whole house, and Mama says you're a hero, and even Ragnar told people you're stronger than 3 men put together." Ulf felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in his chest at her enthusiasm. When had anyone last celebrated his actions? When had his strength been seen as a gift rather than a threat? "I did what anyone would do," he said quietly. But Freya shook her head with 4-year-old certainty. Not anyone could lift those big beams. Not anyone would stay out in the storm to help people who were scared of them. "That's what makes you special." Her words settled into a place in his heart that had been empty for far too long. Perhaps Ragnar had been right to be cautious. The past could never be completely erased, and the capacity for darkness existed in every human soul. But perhaps the old warrior had also been wrong about the impossibility of change, about the futility of hoping for second chances. As they worked together that afternoon, carving a small bird that would eventually join Freya's growing menagerie of wooden creatures, Ulf allowed himself to imagine a future where belonging was possible, where his past served as foundation rather than prison, where the bronze amulet around his neck symbolized protection rather than destruction. The revelation came not through whispered rumors or dramatic confrontation, but through the innocent questions of a child who saw the world without the filters of adult assumption and fear. It was a warm afternoon in early summer, nearly 2 months after the storm that had begun to shift village opinion in Ulf's favor. Freya had become remarkably skilled at carving, her small hands now capable of creating recognizable animals with minimal guidance. They were working on her most ambitious project yet, a family of wooden bears, when she noticed something that had escaped adult observation for 7 long years. "Why do you wear that necklace?" she asked, pointing to the bronze amulet that had become visible during their work. "It's very pretty, but it makes you sad sometimes." Ulf's hands stilled on his carving knife. In all his time in Skelvik, no one had asked about the amulet directly. People had noticed it during the storm, certainly, but the combination of respect and fear that governed their interactions with him had prevented such personal inquiries. He looked down at the bronze disc, its surface worn smooth by decades of wear. The design was simple, but unmistakable to those who knew its meaning. A tree with deep roots and spreading branches, surrounded by protective runes. It was the symbol of the Guardian's oath, worn only by warriors who had dedicated their lives to protecting the innocent. It was given to me a long time ago, he said carefully, by someone who believed I could be better than I was. Freya studied his face with the intensity she brought to all interesting puzzles. Who gave it to you? Was it your family? The question opened a door that Ulf had kept locked for years, releasing memories that flooded back with painful clarity. A small cottage in a valley much like this one, a woman with golden hair and laughing eyes. A little girl who had looked remarkably like Freya, who had called him Papa and believed he could fix anything that was broken. My daughter gave it to me, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Her name was Thera. She would have been about your age when... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence that had haunted him for 7 years. Where is she now? Freya asked with the directness that only children possess. She's gone, Ulf replied, the words carrying the weight of a grief that time had not diminished. She and her mother both. There was a raid on our village. I was away, leading warriors against enemies who threatened other settlements. I thought I was protecting people by fighting far from home. I thought... His voice broke completely. The pieces of the puzzle began arranging themselves in Freya's young mind. She had heard enough adult conversations to understand that sometimes good people died when bad people attacked villages. She had seen the sadness that lived in wounded animals, and knew it was the same sadness she sometimes saw in Ulf's eyes. You couldn't save them, she said softly, reaching out to touch his hand with the instinctive compassion that came naturally to her. That's why you're so sad. The simple statement stripped away years of carefully constructed walls around Ulf's heart. Here was the truth he had been unable to face, spoken by a child who saw clearly what adults had missed entirely. He hadn't come to Skelvik as a dangerous berserker fleeing his crimes. He had come as a broken father fleeing his failure to protect the people he loved most. I was supposed to keep them safe, he whispered, tears he had held back for years, finally finding their way to the surface. That's what fathers do. That's what the oath means. He touched the bronze amulet with shaking fingers. But I failed. Them both? No, Freya said with the absolute certainty that only children can summon. Bad people did bad things. That's not your fault. Papa says sometimes terrible things happen even to good people, and all we can do is try to be better tomorrow than we were today. Eric's wisdom, filtered through his daughter's innocent understanding, struck Ulf like lightning illuminating a dark landscape. For 7 years, he had carried guilt that belonged to the raiders who had destroyed his family, not to the father, who had been trying to protect other families in distant villages. The weight of that realization was overwhelming. He buried his face in his hands and wept, for Thyra and her mother, for the years of self-imposed exile, for the man he had been before grief had broken him into pieces. Freya climbed down from her stool and wrapped her small arms around as much of his massive frame as she could reach, offering comfort the way she would to any wounded creature she had encountered. Her gesture was so purely loving, so free of judgment or fear, that it began healing places in Ulf's soul that he had thought permanently damaged. They stayed that way for a long time, the giant warrior and the fearless child, while afternoon, shadows lengthened around them, and the truth of Ulf's story settled into the space between them. When he had finally gathered himself enough to speak, Ulf found words he hadn't expected to say to anyone. Ever. I came here to disappear, he admitted. I thought if I made myself so frightening that no one would approach, I could avoid caring about anyone again. I thought if I stayed apart, I couldn't fail to protect anyone else. But that's silly, Freya said matter-of-factly. You can't protect people if you stay away from them. You have to be close to help when they need you, like during the storm. Her logic was unassailable. In trying to avoid the pain of potential loss, he had also avoided the possibility of making a difference in anyone's life. The storm had shown him what he could accomplish when he chose connection over isolation, purpose over self-protection. Now, daughter, Freya continued thoughtfully, do you think she would want you to be sad forever? Or would she want you to help other people like you helped us? The question pierced straight to the heart of everything Ulf had been struggling with. Since arriving in Skelvik, Thyra had been a child much like Freya, brave, compassionate, endlessly curious about the world around her. She had loved stories about heroes who used their strength to protect others, who turned their pain into purpose. She would have wanted him to keep being a hero, not hide from the world in shame and self-recrimination. She would want me to help people, he said slowly, the truth of it settling into his bones like warmth returning to a frozen limb. She would want me to remember that the oath I swore was about protecting innocence, not about being perfect. Then that's what you should do, Freya declared, with the confidence of someone who had never doubted that problems could be solved if people just tried hard enough. You should protect people and teach them things and be their friend. That's what heroes do. As the afternoon wound toward evening and Freya prepared to return home, carrying with her the knowledge of Ulf's true story, neither of them realized that their conversation had been overheard. Ragnar Ironbeard had come to speak with Ulf about organizing the young men's woodworking lessons that Eric had suggested weeks earlier. He had arrived in time to hear the giant's confession, to witness the raw grief of a father who had lost everything, to understand finally that the man they had feared for 7 years was not a monster at all. He was a broken hero, trying to figure out how to be whole again. As Ragnar quietly retreated, his mind was already working through the implications of what he had learned. The village needed to know the truth about Ulf Thundertouched, not the stories and rumors that had shaped their fears, but the real story of loss, guilt, and the slow journey toward redemption. The transformation that had begun with a child's fearless declaration was about to reach its culmination, but not in ways that anyone could have predicted. The village council meeting was called for the next evening, though no one except Ragnar knew the true purpose behind the gathering. Word spread quickly that all adult members of the community were expected to attend, and by sunset, the great hall was filled with the low murmur of speculation and concern. Ulf had not been invited, which was both customary and telling. In 7 years, he had never been included in community decisions, despite his status as a landowner and his growing acceptance among some villagers. Tonight, however, his absence felt more significant than usual, as if something momentous was about to unfold that would directly affect his future in Skelvik. Ragnar stood before the assembled community, his weathered face grave with the weight of what he was about to reveal. Around the hall, the faces of his neighbors reflected the full spectrum of village life. Young couples with small children, elderly craftsmen whose skills held the community together, widows who had raised families alone, bachelors who served as the village's first line of defense against external threats. These were people who had trusted his judgment for decades, who had followed his counsel through good times and bad. What he was about to tell them would challenge everything they thought they knew about truth, justice, and the possibility of redemption. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying easily through the hall's familiar acoustics, "we gather tonight to speak of Ulf Thundertouched, the man we have harbored among us for 7 years without truly knowing him." A ripple of tension moved through the crowd. Some had expected this. The giant's growing acceptance had made others nervous, and there had been whispered conversations about whether his integration into village life was happening too quickly, without sufficient consideration of potential consequences. Eric felt his stomach tighten with worry. As the father of the child who had catalyzed Ulf's transformation, he bore a special responsibility for whatever came next. Beside him, Gunhild reached for his hand, her own concerns evident in the set of her shoulders. "I have spoken before of stories that followed him to our village," Ragnar continued. "Stories of violence, of loss of control, of a warrior who had fallen to darkness. Tonight, I learned the truth behind those stories, and it is time you all knew what I have discovered." The hall fell completely silent. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, leaning closer to their parents and waiting with the patience that only comes when adults are discussing matters of life-changing importance. Ulf Thundertouched was indeed once known as the Berserker of Nordfjord, Ragnar said, his words falling like stones into still water. He did lead a war band feared throughout 3 valleys. He was capable of violence that could break armies and reduce fortified positions to rubble. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was confirmation of their worst fears, validation of the caution that had kept them at arm's length from the giant for so long. "But," Ragnar continued, raising his voice slightly to ensure his next words carried clearly, "the stories we heard were incomplete. They told us what he was capable of doing, but not why he did it. They described his power, but not his purpose." He paused, allowing the distinction to settle in the minds of his audience before continuing with the revelation. That would change everything. Ulf Thundertouched wore the bronze amulet of the Guardian's Oath. He was not a berserker who fought for glory or gold. He was a protector who dedicated his life to defending the innocent from those who would harm them. His warband existed to hunt raiders, to break the bands of criminals who preyed on peaceful settlements, to ensure that families like ours could sleep safely in their beds. The shift in the room's atmosphere was immediate and palpable. People who had been preparing to argue for Ulf's expulsion found themselves reconsidering everything they thought they knew about heroism and sacrifice. 7 years ago, Ragnar continued, his voice softening with genuine emotion, Ulf was leading his warriors against a particularly dangerous group of raiders when his own village was attacked by a different band. His wife and daughter, a little girl no older than young Freya, were killed while he was away protecting strangers' families. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. In a community where family was everything, where the bonds between parents and children formed the foundation of society, the magnitude of Ulf's loss was immediately understood. He came to us broken by grief and guilt, convinced that his failure to protect his own family made him unworthy of the oath he had sworn. For 7 years he has punished himself for crimes he did not commit, carrying shame that belonged to the monsters who destroyed his life. Gunhild was crying now, her tears falling freely as she imagined the depth of pain that could drive a father to such isolation. Around the hall, other parents were reaching for their children, holding them closer as they contemplated the unthinkable loss that had shaped the giant's existence. "But in recent weeks," Ragnar continued, "we have seen signs that healing is possible." A little girl's fearless courage began to thaw the ice around his heart. Teaching her to carve reminded him that his hands could create beauty as well as destruction. Working alongside us during the storm showed him that he could still protect people, still honor the oath he thought he had broken. Eric found his voice, speaking into the emotional silence that had fallen over the hall. "He saved our homes, our children. Without his help, half the village would have been lost to the flood." "Yes," Ragnar agreed. "But more than that, he chose to risk himself for people who had never shown him kindness. He could have stayed safe in his house and watched us struggle. Instead, he answered our need without hesitation or condition. That is not the action of a broken man. That is the action of a hero, remembering who he was meant to be." Magnus the fisherman, whose house had been among those most threatened by the failing wall, stood slowly. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of a man who understood debt and honor. "I owe him my family's safety," he said simply. Youngest son sleeps dry in his bed because Ulf Thundertouched chose to help us. If that man is broken, then I pray all our broken places might heal as well as his have. One by one, other voices joined the conversation. Stories emerged of small kindnesses that people had noticed but not spoken of, tools mysteriously repaired and left where their owners would find them, troublesome stumps removed from fields overnight, sick animals found healthy in the morning, after Ulf had been seen nearby. For 7 years, the giant had been quietly serving the community that had given him shelter, asking nothing in return and taking credit for nothing he had done. Young Astrid, Freya's 16-year-old sister, surprised everyone by standing to speak. Her voice shook slightly with nervousness, but her words carried conviction. "He has been teaching my little sister more than just carving," she said. "He has been teaching her about patience, about seeing beauty in simple things, about treating all living creatures with kindness. She comes home from her lessons full of stories about healing injured birds and understanding why the wood wants to become certain shapes. If he is dangerous, then why do his lessons make her more gentle, not less?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable because its implications were so clear. A truly dangerous man would not spend hours teaching a child to find wonder in the world around her. A broken soul would not have the patience to nurture another's growth and discovery. As the discussion continued, a consensus began to emerge that surprised even Ragnar. The village was not just ready to accept Ulf's presence, they were ready to embrace him as a full member of their community, to acknowledge the debt they owed him, and to help him complete the healing that had begun with Freya's fearless declaration. But integration would require more than just acceptance. It would require trust, vulnerability, and the kind of courage that could only come from facing the past honestly and choosing to build something better from its ruins. "What do we do now?" asked Ingrid the Weaver, speaking the question that was on everyone's mind. Ragnar smiled for the first time that evening, his weathered features transformed by genuine warmth. "Now we do what we should have done 7 years ago. We welcome him home." Outside the great hall, unaware of the discussion taking place within, Ulf sat in his workshop carving another small figure for Freya's collection. In the morning, he would learn that his life was about to change again, but this time the transformation would come not from loss and grief, but from acceptance and the possibility of belonging. The bronze amulet around his neck caught the firelight. As he worked, its ancient symbol of protection, taking on new meaning as the community he had quietly served for 7 years prepared to offer him something he had never dared to hope for again, a place to call home. The delegation that approached Ulf's house the next morning was unlike anything Skelvik had ever assembled. At its head walked Ragnar Ironbeard, his usual stern expression replaced by something approaching gentleness. Beside him came Eric and Gunhild, their faces reflecting nervous hope. Behind them followed nearly every adult in the village, including many who had crossed streets to avoid the giant for 7 long years. Most surprising of all, they carried gifts. Ulf noticed the approaching crowd from his workshop window and felt his stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Large groups of villagers had never meant good news for him. Council decisions about property boundaries, warnings about behavior that made others uncomfortable, reminders about maintaining proper distance from community life. He set down his carving knife and stepped outside, squaring his shoulders in preparation for whatever judgment they had come to deliver. The bronze amulet beneath his shirt seemed to grow heavier, a reminder of oaths sworn and broken, of protection offered and failed. "Ulf Thundertouched!" Ragnar called out when they were still several paces away, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "We come to speak with you about truth, about debt, and about belonging." The formal phrasing suggested something significant was about to unfold, but Ulf couldn't guess what direction it might take. He nodded once, the careful gesture of a man who had learned to reveal nothing until he understood the nature of the conversation. "We know," Ragnar continued, stepping closer until they stood face to face. About Thera and her mother, we know. About the oath you swore, and the guilt you have carried. We know about the 7 years you have spent punishing yourself for crimes you did not commit. Ulf's carefully maintained composure cracked like ice under sudden pressure. How could they know? He had told no one except Freya, he whispered, understanding flooding through him with painful clarity. The child had shared his story, as children do, innocent of the implications and consequences that adults attach to truth. She told us you were sad because bad people hurt your family, Gunhild said gently, stepping forward with maternal instinct, overriding years of careful distance. She told us you were a good papa who couldn't save his little girl, and that made you think you were broken. The simple words, filtered through a 4-year-old's understanding, stripped away all the complex shame and self-recrimination that had shaped Ulf's existence for 7 years. Heard through Freya's innocent perspective, his story became not one of failure but of love frustrated by circumstance, of a protector who had been protecting the wrong place at the wrong time. But we have seen the truth with our own eyes, Eric added, his blacksmith's hands steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. We have watched you teach our daughter with patience that could only come from a father's heart. We have seen you risk yourself to save our homes. We have witnessed kindness that you thought no one noticed. Magnus stepped forward next, carrying a carefully wrapped bundle. You repaired my nets after the storm, worked through the night so my family wouldn't lose fishing days. You thought no one saw, but my wife watched from the window. You pulled the stump from my field that had been troubling my plough for 3 seasons, added Olaf. Left my tools cleaner than when you borrowed them. You carved toys for the children and left them where they would find them, never taking credit, said Ingrid. My grandson still plays with the wooden warrior you made, though he doesn't know where it came from. One by one, the villagers stepped forward to share stories of quiet generosity, of problems solved without fanfare, of a man who had been serving his community while believing himself unworthy of belonging to it. With each revelation, Ulf felt the weight of his self-imposed exile, lifting slightly. These people had not just tolerated his presence, they had noticed his efforts, valued his contributions, and remembered his kindness even when he had tried to remain invisible. Why? He asked finally, his voice rough with emotions he had held in check for too long. Why are you telling me this now? Ragnar's weathered face softened with something that might have been regret. Because for 7 years, we have failed you as surely as you believe you failed your family. We accepted your gold and your protection, without offering the one thing you needed most, the chance to belong, to be valued, to remember that heroes are made not by their failures, but by their choice to keep protecting others, despite the cost. The bronze amulet seemed to pulse with warmth against Ulf's chest, as if responding to words he had never dared to hope he might hear. The Guardian's oath was not about being perfect. It was about dedication to a cause larger than oneself, about choosing protection over self-preservation, about finding purpose in service to others, all things he had continued to do, even in his exile, even in his grief. We have come, Ragnar continued, to offer you what we should have offered 7 years ago, not just shelter, but home. Not just tolerance, but belonging. Not just acceptance, but the honor you have earned through service and sacrifice. The moment hung suspended between past and future, between the man Ulf had been and the man he might yet become. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything in Skelvik's history, born from the community's need to formally acknowledge what had been building in hearts and minds for months. At Ragnar's signal, the villagers began to present their gifts, not the elaborate offerings that marked formal alliances or trade agreements, but simple tokens that spoke of everyday belonging and acceptance. Magnus offered a fishing net, hand-woven by his wife. For when you wish to join us on the water, he said, there is always room in our boats for willing hands. Ingrid presented a wool cloak, dyed the deep blue that marked Skelvik's colors. "For winter evenings in the Great Hall," she explained. "Everyone should have a place by the fire when the storms come." Young Bjorn, Eric's nephew, stepped forward with obvious nervousness but clear determination. "Will you teach me to work with wood properly?" he asked. "Not just the basic skills, but the patience and understanding that makes your work so beautiful." The question represented more than a request for instruction. It was an acknowledgement of mastery, a recognition that Ulf possessed knowledge worth seeking and wisdom worth learning from. "I would be honored," Ulf replied, his voice growing stronger. With each exchange, for the first time in 7 years, people were asking for his gifts rather than merely tolerating his presence. But it was Eric who carried the most significant offering. From beneath a cloth wrapping, he produced a wooden shield, not the ornate ceremonial type that decorated the Great Hall, but a working warrior's shield, its surface scarred by use but sound in construction. "This belonged to my father," Eric said, offering it with both hands. "He carried it defending this village for 30 years. We offer it now to you, with the understanding that its purpose remains unchanged, to protect those who cannot protect themselves." The symbolism was unmistakable. They were not just welcoming Ulf as a neighbor, or even as a friend. They were acknowledging him as their protector, their guardian, the keeper of their safety and the defender of their peace. Ulf accepted the shield with hands that trembled slightly, feeling the weight of responsibility and trust it represented. The bronze amulet against his chest seemed to resonate with the moment, as if recognizing the completion of a circle that had been broken 7 years ago. "I accept this trust," he said formally, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "I swear by the oath I have kept, even in my darkest moments, that this village and its people will know protection as long as I draw breath." As he spoke, Freya broke free from her mother's gentle grip and ran to his side, her small hand finding his massive one with the fearless affection that had started everything. Her presence beside him as he renewed his vows seemed to complete some essential element of the ceremony, bridging the gap between his past loss and his present purpose. "And we swear," Ragnar replied, speaking for the entire community, "that you will never again bear your burdens alone. Your grief is our grief, your service is our honor, and your place among us is secured by bonds stronger than blood, the choice to stand together against whatever darkness may come." The formal words triggered something profound in Ulf's mind and heart. For 7 years, he had carried not just grief but isolation, believing that his failure to save his own family meant he was unworthy of protecting anyone else. But surrounded by these people who had witnessed his service and chosen to value it, he finally understood the truth that Freya had tried to show him. Heroism was not about being perfect. It was about showing up again and again to do what was right, regardless of past failures or future uncertainties. The ceremony concluded with something unprecedented in Skelvik's tradition. A communal meal prepared not in the Great Hall, but in the open space around Ulf's house, transforming his place of exile into the center of celebration. As evening approached and the last of the villagers began to make their way home, Ulf found himself sitting by his doorstep, with Freya curled up beside him, both of them watching. The sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "Are you still sad?" she asked quietly, her head resting against his arm. Ulf considered the question seriously, as he always did with her inquiries. The grief for Thyra and her mother would never completely disappear. Such losses leave permanent marks on the soul. But for the first time in 7 years, that grief was balanced by something else: purpose, belonging, and the knowledge that his life had meaning beyond his failures. "I am sad about losing them," he said finally. "But I am not sad about being here, with you and your family and all the people who have become my people. Sometimes, I think, we can hold both sadness and joy at the same time." Freya nodded sagely, as if this made perfect sense to her 4-year-old understanding of the world's complexities. "Thyra would like you," she announced with absolute confidence. She would be happy that you found us. And in that moment, with the bronze amulet warm against his chest and the trust of an entire community resting on his shoulders, Ulf Thundertouched finally understood that healing was not about forgetting the past. It was about choosing to build something beautiful from its ruins. 2 years later, the workshop behind Ulf's house had become the heart of something unexpected, a place where not just wood was shaped, but where young minds learned to see possibility in rough materials and patience in the slow work of creation. Bjorn had become Ulf's first formal apprentice, his eager hands now capable of producing work that would have made master craftsmen proud. But he was no longer alone in his studies. 7 other young people from Skelvik and the surrounding settlements had joined what the villagers had come to call the Giant School, drawn by stories of teaching that transformed not just wood, but character. On this particular morning, as winter's grip began to loosen and the first hints of spring stirred in the mountain air, Ulf stood watching his students work with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found his true calling. Each young person bent over their individual projects, their concentration complete, their progress measured not in speed but in understanding. Freya, now 6 and possessed of remarkable skill for her age, was putting the finishing touches on. A wooden raven, its wings spread as if caught in eternal flight. She had insisted on making it herself as a gift for her new baby brother, born just 3 months earlier to Eric and Gunhild's surprised delight. "Is the wing angle right?" she asked, holding up her work for Ulf's inspection with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. Ulf examined the carving with the same careful attention he would give to any master's work. The proportions were excellent, the detail work showed real artistic understanding, and the overall piece captured something essential about the spirit of flight that went beyond mere technical proficiency. "It's perfect," he said, and meant it. "Your brother will treasure it always." The workshop had expanded twice since those first lessons, but it retained the peaceful atmosphere that had made it special from the beginning. Sunlight streamed through carefully placed windows, illuminating workbenches arranged so that each student could see their instructor clearly while maintaining their own creative space. Tools hung in precise order along the walls, each one maintained, with the care that came from understanding their importance. But the most significant change was not in the workshop itself. It was in the man who presided over it. Gone was the haunted isolation that had defined Ulf's existence for so many years. In its place was the calm confidence of someone who had found his purpose and embraced it fully. The bronze amulet still hung around his neck, but now it caught the light differently, reflecting not the burden of past failures, but the joy of present service. "Master Ulf," called Astrid from her position near the window, "could you help me with this joint? I think I understand the principle, but the execution isn't matching my intention." The title Master had emerged naturally among his students, a recognition of both skill and the deeper wisdom that came from living through loss and finding meaning on the other side. Ulf had initially protested the formality, but the young people had insisted. In a world where respect was earned through demonstrated competence and character, the title felt appropriate. As he worked with Astrid to solve her joinery problem, Ulf marveled at how naturally teaching had come to him. Each student brought different challenges, different learning styles, different dreams for what they hoped to create with their newly acquired skills. Meeting each where they were, helping them progress at their own pace, celebrating small victories, while gently correcting mistakes. All of it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Perhaps, he reflected, this was what he had always been meant to do. The years of warfare and protection had been necessary, but they had also been preparation for something deeper, the patient work of helping others discover their own capabilities and potential. The workshop door opened, admitting a familiar figure who brought with her the energy and warmth that had transformed everything 7 long years ago. But this was not the 4-year-old who had fearlessly declared herself unafraid. Of giants, this Freya moved with the emerging grace of a child growing into herself, her golden hair now long enough to braid in the style of older girls, her green eyes bright with intelligence and curiosity. "Papa sent me to remind everyone that the feast preparations begin at sunset," she announced to the room. "The harvest celebration waits for no one, not even dedicated woodworkers." The harvest celebration had become one of Skelvik's most cherished traditions, a time when the entire community gathered to give thanks for the year's abundance and to strengthen the bonds that held them together through difficult times. Ulf's integration into village life had reached the point where his absence from such gatherings would be noticed and regretted. As the students began cleaning their workspaces and preparing to leave, Freya approached Ulf with the wooden raven cradled carefully in her hands. "Do you think baby Thor will like it?" she asked, using the nickname she had given her brother despite his official name of Eric. "I think he will love it," Ulf replied, crouching down to examine her work one more time. "But more importantly, when he's old enough to understand, he will love the story of how his sister learned to carve it." "The story of how you taught me, you mean," Freya corrected, with the precision that characterized her approach to truth. "The story of how we taught each other," Ulf said gently. "The best teaching always goes both ways." As evening approached, and the workshop emptied, Ulf stood alone among the workbenches and tools, listening to the familiar sounds of community life drifting through the windows. Children playing in the square, mothers calling them home for supper, fathers discussing the day's work as they made their way back from fields and forge. These were the sounds of peace, of safety, of a place where people could focus on building rather than merely surviving. They were the sounds he had spent his warrior years protecting, though he had never fully understood their value until he became part of their creation. The bronze amulet caught the last rays of sunlight streaming through the window, and for a moment Ulf could almost feel Thira's presence beside him, not the crushing weight of loss that had defined so many years, but the gentle warmth of approval from a daughter who would have been proud to see her father teaching other children to find beauty in wood and patience in the slow work of creation. Sometimes, he thought, as he prepared to join the harvest celebration, the greatest victory was not in the battles won, but in the peace that followed, not in the enemies. Defeated, but in the lives nurtured and protected. Sometimes healing came not from forgetting the past, but from allowing it to guide the building of something better. And sometimes a giant's greatest strength was measured not in the weight he could lift, but in the gentleness with which he could guide small hands toward their own discoveries.